Hi everyone! Welcome to week 4 of Lit 215 for the summer of 2021. I am currently in the process of moving apartments this week and it is an absolute mess, so you are just going to have to make do with the melodious sound of my voice. So I'll make this short and sweet. We're going to discuss a couple things in this video, the assignments for week 4, and then our focus this week in our readings is on forcefully oppressed stories in multicultural literature. And I'll also give you a little background on the 1970s, which is relevant to these readings. So before we begin, some reminders for your assignments for week 4 include you do have a reading quiz due by Thursday. There are, I think, 5 readings for this week, so I would recommend starting early. It might take you some time. Then we'll have discussion board 4, which you should be used to by now. Post on Thursday, respond to classmates by Sunday. And then you have a major assignment 4, which is going to be a literary critique, which I am hoping will help you to kind of think about your final project. So if you have questions about these assignments, please let me know. But otherwise, make sure that you read the assignment sheet for the literary critique, and I will discuss that in just a minute as well. So before we get into specifically the readings for this week, I wanted to talk about a little bit of the 1970s. So the last 2-3 weeks, we've talked about really from the 2020 to the 1990s and then the 1980s, and now we're in the 70s, moving backwards a little bit. So the text that we're using calls the 1970s a decade of disillusionment, which I think is actually quite astute. So disillusioned means to be disappointed in someone or something that you discover to be less good than you believed it to be. And really, the 1970s was a pretty significant time for the US and for Americans as we became disillusioned about what America stood for and what it came to be. So I think the 50s and the 40s, which we'll talk about in a few weeks, there was really this idea of the US as a savior, as a, world superpower, as a very good, morally right place. And the 1970s was a time where that perception really broke. Some significant events to keep in mind as you're reading these stories, the Watergate scandal and President Nixon's resignation was huge for this time period. Also, the trauma and loss of the Vietnam War, which was probably one of the most significant political experiences for the US, in that it was one of the first times that the American people were not mostly in support of the US's participation in the war. Some other, economic considerations were an increase in inflation and oil shortages, and then the Islamist revolution in Iran, which, as we talked about last week, had a large effect on the 1980s. So really at this point, there was a loss of individual control and a feeling of not knowing who or what to believe. In our popular culture at this time, we saw really a larger focus on what your text calls America's quote unquote underbelly. So an increase in stories that are not perfect. And at that point, this kind of started to bleed into our literature. So there were some positives to multicultural literature at this time, particularly in a rise in Latinx, Native American, and feminist stories. Toni Morrison began her career in the 1970s, and we'll read one of her pieces this week. Really, and I think your text does a great job of summing this up. This is a quote from this summary page in your text. It says, "An indisputably turbulent decade, the 1970s revealed a number of cultural anxieties about the direction of the nation. Literature remained a powerful means of addressing those anxieties, providing a forum for previously unheard or muted voices and preparing the way for a more tolerant future." So, not to say that the 70s were all bad, but it was almost like the US had to kind of grow up during the 70s. And just like many of us, when we get to a point where we're old enough to see behind the curtain and to understand, say, that our parents are just humans who happen to have children. So I think that was kind of what the 70s was for us. But these previously unheard or muted voices is actually going to be the focus of our readings this week. So I am calling these forcefully oppressed stories in an effort not to say that not all of these experiences are going to be the same. And there's a lot of discussion about whether, using the term colonized or using the term previously enslaved, or for some reason those terms really aren't doing it for me. So I choose to call these forcefully oppressed because I think that really encompasses the experience of a lot of the readings we're going to read this week. So particularly Native American and Black experiences. So the stories we're going to read do focus on the generational impact of colonialism, both the impact of those communities that have been colonized and after the colonizers have left. For example, the story by Jamaica Kincaid about Antigua will really give you guys an idea of what I'm meaning here. So I just want you all to keep in mind that these are incredibly nuanced experiences. So just by reading the one story from a Native American author probably won't give you a full and clear picture of the cultural experience of all Native American authors. I mean, there are hundreds of tribes, thousands of languages, and the same goes for Black experiences that we have in the US. So I do want you guys to keep in mind that although, and I think it's the same for if we said, when we say quote unquote white people, that really does encompass a large number of experiences, but I want to caution you not to group these all the same and to understand that these authors are individual people with individual experiences, and that's important to remember. I'm really excited to see what you guys think about these readings. This week's readings are actually some of my favorite. Questions to ask yourself while you're reading. How would being forcefully oppressed impact my view of my country, of my family, of myself, of those who are oppressing me? What aspects of our culture can be traced back to colonialism? And I think this is a difficult question and one that maybe some of us aren't as aware of or able to put ourselves in that space, but I really want to encourage you to try. And then how have the histories of those forcefully oppressed contributed to our current race relations in the U.S.? There's a lot of tension in particularly between certain communities in the U.S., and it's important to understand how historical events may still be impacting that tension. All right, so give that some thought. And then finally, let's talk about your major assignment for this week. So last week, you completed a reading list for your project, and this week, what you're going to do is choose one of those pieces, one of the multicultural literature pieces, to analyze. It's going to be about 3 pages long, and it's going to have 4 parts. So what I want you all to do is very carefully follow each of these parts. If you do each of these things, you're going to be fine. So first, you're going to want to summarize the piece that you've chosen. And I do encourage you to choose one of the pieces from your project, but if there's another that you've come across that you want to dig into, I'm totally fine with that. You're going to summarize it first, so spend a little bit of time just telling me what the story's about. And I would say your summary probably should be about a paragraph, maybe 2. Then the biggest chunk of your critique, your literary critique, is going to be an evaluation. So this is where you're going to tell me, what are the goals of this piece and how well does it achieve those goals? This is where you can talk about what's interesting to you, what stood out to you, what you think is significant. And opinion is fine as long as you back it up with examples from the piece. So quoting and paraphrasing is great, and I'll post some resources for you to do that in MLA format. Then I'd like to discuss the author and the publication. So is this piece part of a larger piece of work? Who is the author? When did they write it? How has their life and experience maybe influenced the piece itself? And then finally, you'll want a reference page in MLA format. So the assignment sheet for this is quite detailed, and I encourage you to read it and let me know if you have any questions. Alrighty, so that'll do it for this week. Thank you guys for checking in, and I will see you online. And next week, hopefully, we'll be in a clean new apartment so you can see my face again.